The fear of loss does not arrive gently. It does not ask permission, and it does not move through reason. It enters the psyche like a sudden darkness, activating parts of the self that were never meant to be seen in daylight. When someone senses they are about to lose what they are emotionally attached to, the polite, controlled version of their personality begins to weaken, and what emerges instead is the shadow, the repressed, denied, and often misunderstood side of the self. The shadow is not evil, but it is raw. It carries instincts, unmet needs, unspoken desires, and unresolved wounds. Under normal circumstances, it stays hidden behind social masks, discipline, and self-image. But fear has a unique power. It strips away performance. When loss feels imminent, the psyche stops prioritizing how one appears and starts prioritizing how one survives emotionally. This is why people behave so differently when they fear losing someone. They may become possessive after years of restraint, vulnerable after long emotional distance, or confrontational after silence. These reactions often shock both the person experiencing them and the one witnessing them. That shock exists because the shadow does not follow the rules the conscious mind lives by. It responds to threat, not logic. Loss threatens more than the relationship itself. It threatens identity. When someone becomes deeply attached, that bond quietly shapes their inner world. It influences how they see themselves, how they regulate emotions, and how they experience meaning. The idea of losing that bond feels like psychological amputation, and the shadow awakens precisely at this point, when the ego realizes it may not survive intact. The shadow contains everything the ego rejected in order to feel safe or acceptable. Desire, jealousy, dependency, fear of abandonment, emotional intensity, all of it lives there. When the fear of loss rises, these rejected traits demand expression. That is why someone may suddenly say what they swore they would never say, admit feelings they denied even to themselves, or take actions that contradict their carefully built self-image. This awakening is not conscious. People do not decide to access their shadow. It happens automatically because the unconscious does not negotiate when it senses danger. It moves to protect what it believes is essential for psychological stability. In this state, behavior becomes symbolic rather than rational. Actions are driven by ancient emotional patterns formed long before logic had authority. This is also why fear of loss can feel overwhelming. It creates inner conflict. The conscious mind wants to remain composed, dignified, and controlled. The shadow wants to act, to claim, to preserve, to avoid abandonment at any cost. The tension between these forces can lead to impulsive decisions, emotional outbursts, or dramatic shifts in behavior. Yet this awakening is not purely destructive. It reveals truth. The shadow exposes what truly matters. It shows where attachment lives, where fear hides, and where emotional dependency has been denied. Without fear, these aspects remain unconscious. With fear, they rise to the surface demanding recognition. Some people attempt to suppress this awakening. They double down on control, pretending indifference, masking fear with pride. But suppression only strengthens the shadow's pressure. Others allow it to surface, confronting parts of themselves they have avoided for years. In those moments, growth becomes possible because awareness begins where denial ends. The fear of loss does not create the shadow, it reveals it. It shows the depth of attachment, the intensity of longing, and the vulnerability hidden beneath strength. And once the shadow has been awakened, it cannot simply be put back to sleep. because it has already spoken, already moved, already reshaped the inner landscape in ways that cannot be undone once the person realizes what they are truly afraid of losing, and why love does not operate only on the surface of the mind. While it may begin as attraction, admiration, or choice, its real power lies beneath awareness. Love quietly descends into the unconscious, activating memories, patterns, and emotional structures that were formed long before the present moment. This is why love rarely feels simple. It touches layers of the psyche that logic cannot regulate. When love emerges, it does not ask what is convenient or safe. It awakens material that has been dormant, early attachments, unmet needs, fears of abandonment, and long buried desires for connection. These elements shape how a person loves, how they react to closeness, and how they respond to the possibility of loss. The unconscious does not differentiate between past and present. It experiences emotional intensity as a continuation of earlier wounds and hopes. This activation explains why love can feel irrational. People find themselves reacting more strongly than the situation seems to justify. Small gestures feel profound. Silence feels threatening. Distance feels unbearable. These reactions are not about the present interaction alone. They are echoes. Love opens a channel through which unresolved emotional material flows into the present, often without warning. The conscious mind likes to believe it chooses love carefully. But the unconscious is drawn to familiarity, not reason. It recognizes emotional patterns that resemble early experiences, whether nurturing or painful. This recognition creates a sense of magnetism that feels fated or uncontrollable. Love, in this sense, is not just connection, it is repetition seeking resolution. Because of this, love often activates conflict alongside desire. The same bond that brings comfort also triggers fear. Closeness awakens vulnerability. Intimacy threatens defenses that were built to survive emotional injury. The unconscious responds by testing, withdrawing, clinging, or provoking, not to destroy the connection, but to understand whether it is safe. This is why people may sabotage relationships they claim to value. The unconscious is not guided by promises or intentions. It is guided by emotional memory. If love resembles a past wound, the psyche may attempt to relieve the pattern in hopes of achieving a different outcome. What looks like self-destruction is often an unconscious attempt at healing. Love also activates creativity, longing, and imagination. The unconscious begins projecting meaning onto the beloved. They become a symbol for wholeness, security, or escape. This projection intensifies attachment, but it also distorts perception. The person is not only loved for who they are, but for what they represent within the psyche. When reality challenges that projection, disappointment and confusion arise. As love deepens, the unconscious demands integration. It brings forward neglected parts of the self, emotional sensitivity, dependency, tenderness, and fear. These traits often contradict the persona a person presents to the world. Love forces confrontation with these contradictions. It asks whether one can remain authentic while exposed. Many resist this process. They attempt to control love, define it, or keep it contained. But the unconscious does not respond to control. It responds to emotional truth. When love is denied, it does not disappear. It expresses itself indirectly through dreams, mood shifts, obsessions, and unexpected behavior. This is why love transforms people, even when they try to remain unchanged. It reorganizes priorities, reshapes identity, and alters emotional boundaries. The unconscious reorients itself around the bond, recalibrating what feels meaningful and what feels threatening. To love is to invite the unconscious into the present moment. It is to allow hidden material to surface, not because something is wrong, but because love seeks wholeness. It demands awareness of what has been ignored, feared, or denied. And once activated, the unconscious continues to influence perception, behavior, and emotional reality long after the initial feeling has been named, shaping how love is experienced, expressed, and endured beyond conscious control. The ego survives by maintaining structure. It depends on consistency, identity, and the belief that life is predictable enough to be managed. A meaningful bond quietly becomes part of that structure. It integrates into how a person sees themselves, how they regulate emotion, and how they orient their sense of stability. When that bond is threatened, the ego does not respond calmly. It begins to fracture. At first, the ego tries to preserve control. It rationalizes, minimizes, and explains away the threat. It tells itself that nothing essential is at risk, that independence remains intact, that loss would be manageable. This is not strength, it is denial. The ego is attempting to protect its image of competence and emotional self-sufficiency. But bonds do not exist only on the surface. They operate beneath awareness, shaping expectations and emotional safety. When the possibility of separation becomes real, the ego senses that its familiar structure may not survive unchanged. The fear is not simply about losing another person. It is about losing coherence. The ego fears fragmentation. This is the moment pressure builds. The roles a person has adopted, strong, detached, rational, composed, begin to strain under emotional weight. The ego cannot maintain these positions while simultaneously experiencing vulnerability. Something must give. And when it does, the ego cracks. This breaking often appears as contradiction. A person may oscillate between confidence and desperation, detachment and intensity, logic and emotion. These swings are not manipulation, they are signs of a structure losing its balance. The ego is attempting to reassert control while being undermined by forces it cannot dominate. When the bond is threatened, the ego's defenses become more visible. Pride hardens. Justifications multiply. Blame may be projected outward to avoid inner collapse. At the same time, suppressed fears surface: fear of abandonment, fear of insignificance, fear of emotional dependence. The ego was built to keep these fears at bay. Now they are unavoidable. This breaking can also manifest as unexpected humility. The ego, realizing it cannot survive alone, may abandon its rigid posture. Apologies emerge where none existed before. Vulnerability appears in places once guarded. The ego surrenders not because it wants to, but because it must adapt to survive the emotional reality it can no longer deny. What makes this process so destabilizing is that the ego equates attachment with weakness. It believes needing another person threatens autonomy. Yet when the bond is endangered, the ego discovers that autonomy was partially an illusion. Emotional reliance was present all along, simply unacknowledged. The breaking occurs when this truth becomes undeniable. This rupture forces confrontation. The ego must face the parts of the self it excluded to maintain its image: dependency, longing, fear, tenderness. These traits surge forward, demanding recognition. The ego can no longer pretend it is untouched. The bond has already shaped it. Some respond to this breaking with control. They attempt to dominate the situation, withdraw emotionally, or sever the bond preemptively to regain a sense of power. Others experience collapse, confusion, anxiety, or emotional flooding. Both responses arise from the same source, an ego struggling to survive the loss of a structure it relied upon. Yet within this breaking lies the possibility of reorganization. When the ego can no longer maintain its old form, it must either rigidify or evolve. Threatened bonds expose the fragility of identity built on avoidance and self-image. They reveal how much of the ego was constructed to avoid vulnerability rather than integrate it. The breaking is not a failure of character, it is a psychological event. It marks the point where the ego confronts its limits and realizes that connection has already altered it in irreversible ways, forcing a reckoning between who the person believed they were and who they have become through attachment to someone who now stands on the edge of being lost. Separation anxiety is often misunderstood as weakness, but psychologically it is a signal of deep attachment. It arises when a bond has moved beyond choice and entered the realm of necessity. At this stage, the presence of the other has become intertwined with emotional regulation, identity, and meaning. When that presence is threatened, the psyche reacts with urgency, not because it is fragile, but because it senses disruption to its internal order. This anxiety does not remain confined to fear. It spreads through the inner system, activating reflection, memory, and instinct. The mind begins replaying moments, reassessing behaviors, and questioning assumptions that once felt solid. What was previously taken for granted now becomes uncertain. This uncertainty destabilizes routine patterns of thought, creating psychological pressure that demands change. Transformation begins here not as a conscious decision, but as a response to internal imbalance. The psyche seeks to restore equilibrium. It examines habits that once provided safety, but now threaten connection. Defensive behaviors that once protected the self are exposed as barriers. Separation anxiety functions like an alarm, signaling that existing strategies are no longer sufficient. Under this pressure, awareness deepens. The individual becomes conscious of emotional needs that were previously ignored or dismissed. Dependency, longing, and fear of abandonment surface, challenging the self-image of independence or emotional control. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Transformation requires the recognition of what has been denied. Separation anxiety also activates memory. Past losses, early attachments, and unresolved separations rise to the surface. The psyche does not experience the current threat in isolation. It links it to earlier emotional imprint. This layering intensifies the emotional response, making the anxiety feel disproportionate. In reality, it is cumulative. The present moment becomes a convergence point for unresolved emotional history. As anxiety intensifies, old coping mechanisms begin to fail. Avoidance no longer brings relief. Emotional suppression becomes exhausting. The individual is forced to engage with their inner reality rather than escape it. This forced engagement is the crucible of transformation. The psyche cannot return to its previous state without addressing the underlying conflict. Behavior often changes during this phase. People may reach out where they once withdrew, speak where they once stayed silent, or confront issues they long avoided. These actions are not always graceful or well planned. They are attempts by the psyche to adapt, to find a new configuration that can sustain connection without collapse. Separation anxiety strips away illusions of control. It reveals how much emotional stability depended on the bond. This realization can feel destabilizing, even humiliating. yet it also opens the door to growth. By acknowledging reliance, the individual gains the opportunity to develop internal resources rather than deny vulnerability. Transformation does not mean eliminating anxiety. It means understanding its message. The anxiety points to areas of emotional immaturity, unhealed wounds, or unmet needs. When these areas are explored rather than resisted, integration begins. Emotional responses become more conscious, less reactive. Some resist this process by blaming the other, numbing themselves, or clinging more tightly to old patterns. This resistance prolongs suffering. Others allow the anxiety to guide introspection. They recognize that the pain is not only about losing someone, but about losing a version of themselves that depended on avoidance or denial. Through this process, identity shifts, values are reconsidered, priorities change, emotional awareness expands, the individual becomes more capable of intimacy because they have confronted the fear that intimacy evokes. Separation anxiety, when endured and examined, reshapes the psyche, not by breaking it, but by forcing it to reorganize around truth rather than defense, leaving behind a self that is no longer structured around fear of loss, but shaped by a deeper understanding of connection, vulnerability, and emotional responsibility. Unexpected actions rarely come from nowhere. They emerge when the conscious story a person tells about themselves can no longer contain what is happening beneath the surface. When behavior suddenly shifts, when someone acts in ways that contradict their established pattern, it is often the result of inner material pushing past control. These moments expose truths that words' intentions and self-descriptions have been hiding. Most people live within a predictable emotional structure. They develop habits, roles, and responses that protect their identity and maintain stability. This structure allows them to function, but it also conceals deeper motivations and fears. As long as life remains manageable, these hidden elements stay buried. It is pressure, emotional, relational, or existential, that forces them into view. When a bond is threatened or a loss feels imminent, the psyche prioritizes expression over consistency. The need to preserve emotional meaning overrides the need to appear composed. In these moments, actions are no longer carefully curated. They are driven by urgency. What emerges is not strategy, but truth expressed through behavior. This is why unexpected actions often feel shocking. They disrupt the image someone has cultivated. A person who appeared detached suddenly pleads. Someone emotionally reserved confesses vulnerability. Calm individual reacts with intensity. These actions reveal what the conscious mind worked to suppress: attachment, fear, desire, dependency, or longing. Words can lie. Behavior under pressure rarely does. When emotional stakes rise, the psyche reveals what it values most. The unconscious does not debate, it acts. In doing so, it exposes priorities that were previously denied or minimized. What someone does in moments of fear tells more about them than what they say in moments of comfort. These revelations are not always flattering. Unexpected actions may include jealousy, control, withdrawal, or aggression. Such behaviors expose insecurities and unresolved wounds. They point to emotional immaturity or unhealed trauma. Yet even these reactions carry information. They show where fear resides and where growth is needed. Hidden truths are often inconvenient. They challenge self-image. A person may have believed they were independent only to act desperately when faced with separation. They may have claimed emotional strength only to unravel under threat. These contradictions are not failures. They are revelations. They show the gap between who someone thought they were and who they actually are when stakes are real. Unexpected actions also reveal the depth of connection. People rarely change behavior unless something meaningful is at risk. When someone breaks routine, crosses boundaries, or violates their own rules, it signals that the situation has touched a core emotional need. The action becomes a symbolic statement of value. Observers often misinterpret these moments. They judge the behavior without understanding its psychological origin. But unexpected actions are messages from the unconscious. They communicate what could not be expressed safely before. In this sense, they are confessions without words. These truths can be uncomfortable to witness. They force re-evaluation of relationships and assumptions. They strip away illusions. Once revealed, they cannot be unseen. The image of the person shifts. So does the understanding of the bond. For the person acting, these moments are often followed by confusion or shame. The ego struggles to reconcile the behavior with its self-concept. Rational explanations may follow, but they often fail to fully account for the intensity of the action. The truth has already been expressed. Whether these revelations lead to growth or fragmentation depends on how they are integrated. If denied, the cycle repeats. If examined, the individual gains insight into their emotional reality. Unexpected actions, though disruptive, offer clarity. They reveal what lies beneath control, beneath intention, beneath narrative. In moments when behavior breaks pattern, the psyche speaks directly. It shows what matters, what hurts, and what has been hidden. These actions are not accidents. They are disclosures, surfacing when the cost of silence becomes greater than the cost of exposure, leaving behind a clearer, if more complex, understanding of the self and the emotional truth that has been guiding it all along.